for some reaction about what these tariffs could mean for Canada. I'm joined by Cobden. She's the president and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. Thank you for coming into studio.
Thanks, Catherine.
So I have to start, obviously, by asking you, what is your reaction to what you just heard?
Obviously, we're disappointed. We thought we should and could and might still, if the March 4th date holds, seek an exemption to these tariffs. Canada is a very unique trading partner on steel with the United States. So we expect and hope that our government is explaining again our business case or our rationale for why we should be exempted. And so if that date can be confirmed, we haven't seen the executive order yet, but if that date is confirmed, then perhaps that gives us more opportunity to do that. And then I'll say the other reaction I have is, well, if this is going forward, Canada, it's time to act.
Okay, so a few things we all want to hear what does it's time to act mean, but I think first it's probably important for folks to understand, if these tariffs come into effect, what does that look like for the businesses you represent? What does it mean for Canada?
So I want to say that in 2018, we had tariffs of 25% for a year. And these tariffs were actually devastating to the industry on both sides of the border. That's how we got, how did we, Canada, successfully get out of tariff regime back then? Well, it's because there was enough pain on the American side as well to compel. Now, why is that? Well, we have $20 billion of trade between our two countries. You have steel moving back and forth. We're highly integrated for transformations for market uses. So we're their largest definitely their largest import market share into the United States, but so are they to us. They're our largest steel supplier that's outside of our country.
I think that could be confusing for some Canadians who would say, well then, could everybody just play in their own sandbox and everything would be fine? Explain why that is, the simple solution is not.
It's not. So easy. It does sound great, but that's not actually in practical terms the way it works, because we have steel that they need and they have steel that we need, and why make it here if we can get it, there. We also, there's many examples of different types of products that we make that they don't make, and that sort of thing.
We need each other, is
we
what
need
you're
each
saying.
other, exactly. The other comment I wanted to make about our previous experience was we saw a price surge. We saw, prices go up by 38%. Maybe that's helpful or maybe that isn't, right? Depending on the circumstances. I think in this economy, that is a challenge that will come back, I think, through the American people of concern. But for now, that's a bit of a reflection on history, and I'm hopeful that those, But the other really important point is we're not in 2018 anymore. Since that time, we have done substantial things in Canada to keep pace with the United States trading regime on steel specifically. And so that's, also, I think, part of the business case to pursue an off-ramp. I noted this afternoon, Australia is engaging in those kind of conversations, and I presume Canada will be as well.
You talk about prices going up. I mean, does this, again, presuming it goes ahead, and we'll put a big asterisk next to that, given the amount of time that, according to reports, it remains to be seen. But presuming this goes ahead, does it mean loss of business? Do Canadian businesses move to the United States? Are there job losses? What are some more concrete?
All of that's already started, I will say, for sure. But I think the degree, how far it gets and how damaging it gets to the Canadian steel production capacity will very much depend on how Canada reacts. So, that's where the time to act piece kicks in, because, there are things we could be doing a whole lot better in Canada to support our domestic steel industry. And I think this is a crisis that's going to command that attention to adjust our policies and our approaches to ensure that domestic steel has a better chance of succeeding in our own market.
So you've got a wish list, which presumably you have shared with the government. What's at the top of the list?
So the most important thing is we have to get unfair trade out of our marketplace. So for example, let me share you a fact. Everything we send, up to everything, 97% or more of what we share with the United States has been melted in USMCA regions. So either United States, Mexico, or Canada. Here in our own country, we don't even have that track record. We have a significant volume of steel coming in from offshore import locations that are proven to be unfair traders.
Are we talking primarily about China here?
We're talking about China, but there's many other countries. There's a wide range of cases against steel producers globally. I will say as a result of Chinese overcapacity, but lots of steel moves from China to other countries before it comes here. So job one, if it isn't to get out of the tariffs, if we're facing the tariffs, we have to retaliate, and then we also have to do more to protect our domestic market from unfair trade.
Now, I note that the government has taken action since 2018
Yes.
on this. There are tariffs, I believe, on
China.
Chinese steel.
Yep.
Why is that not good enough?
Well, that's just China direct.
Okay.
So China does a lot to move steel through other countries. I mean, that's part of the concern, I think, that the Trump administration has with some of our other trading allies, is how much Chinese steel is moving through there. The great news is this fact that I'm telling you, 97%. So we are not done. We're not a backdoor to China. That number tells you we are USMCA, fair traders, and that's what we do. So, but those other measures that you mentioned are really critical, and I think that's, we took China direct tariffs, and we've taken transparency of supply. So now every import that comes into the country, whether it's, from China or rerouted, you will know exactly where it was made. And that's really important to the United States and to ourselves to have that kind of visibility. So my thoughts are, these are really strong points to get out of this. But if we don't get out of this, we need to retaliate hard and fast, and then we need to look to what can we do in our own market, because that's all we'll have left.
When you talk, I pause there because obviously that's a significant point.
Yeah.
When you talk about we need to retaliate, to your mind, do we copy and paste the playbook from last time? Are we back to Florida orange juice and Kentucky bourbon, and maybe we make some alterations based on where the political power is now, or is this a whole new ballgame?
So I think there's a lot of utility to some of the previous approaches. I will say, however, we were quite concerned last weekend when the Canadian government did not have steel tariffs in the first initial reaction. So one of the things we're very actively pursuing right now is steel must be part of the very initial retaliation.
So my understanding, there was going to be a second set of products where they wanted to consult. Is it that you believe that they would want a consultation process, and you're saying that's not the case, or you're worried that you're...
We were disappointed that they decided to put us in that second tranche in what happened last weekend. I know it's just a few days. Just a few days ago. It feels
Who can keep track anymore?
Yeah. But honestly, we don't believe that's necessary. There's a lot of knowledge about steel trade and steel inputs across this country and between our two nations. So we think we can act now, and we're asking the government to do so.
Again, when it comes to the question of counter tariffs, all of this is economic pain for Canadians. So what case would you make to folks who maybe don't feel very personally invested in the steel industry? They think, okay, well, this is obviously bad for Canada, but how would you explain to them why this kind of economic pain is necessary?
Well, I want to mention that, first of all, I'd like to appeal to Canadians. And by the way, I don't feel like I need to appeal very much. I am shocked and really blown away by the support we have received right across this country over the last 24 hours from people, citizens, organizations, obviously, political parties, et cetera. A wide swath of Canadians have been today standing united with us, and we really are grateful for that. I've forgotten what the point
is. Is it comparable to last time?
No, it's more.
Yeah. And what do you make of that?
Because we're in this moment of so much chaos and uncertainty. We just don't know what, and some of the broader context of what the president is saying about our country, that's kind of, inflamed this interest of standing up for Canadians and Canadian industry.
I wonder, you and I spoke on CBC Radio's The House, which is the show that I normally host, right as President Trump was reelected, the days after the election. And you said, I'm not highly optimistic, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we have done work since last time. You felt like this scenario that we seem to be on the precipice of was avoidable. Yeah. Now, with that, 2 months plus of time, how do you make sense of the fact that optimism seems to have been misplaced?
Yeah, well, I'm hopeful that we're going to push to the wall to get this out and to get ourselves out. And, I will point to USW International, the United Steelworkers Union, a very powerful union in the States and in Canada, came out just today, moments before I walked in, to say that Canada should be exempt from this tariff. That's powerful. So I'm not ready to give up. We're going to fight this fight because we must for the sake of the domestic industry. Oh, I wanted to say, you were asking me, how do I appeal to Canadians? Well, first I said, I don't think we need to do that. They're there. But I would add that, Canadians need to think about, or hopefully will think about, not need to, but hopefully will consider the strategic nature of the steel industry. If you are a country that needs, steel for your automotive sector, your energy sector, your defense sector, your critical infrastructure sector, we're very strategic. We don't want to be reliant on other nations for these types of, solutions. We need to build a bridge, or we need to build a nuclear power plant, or we need to build a new tank. We want to know that we have some Canadian supply. We don't want to be reliant entirely on other nations for those really core things.
It is interesting to note this date of March 4th, and I know you want to be cautious with this because neither you nor I have seen the executive order, but as being reported by Bloomberg is, of course, the same day that the 30-day reprieve is also supposed to be up. I said a moment ago that when you and I spoke the days after Donald Trump was elected, you said you were cautiously optimistic. How would you describe how you feel now with these few weeks ahead of us?
All I'll say is we are, the Canadian steel industry, united in our fight against this challenge, and that we are ready to work with our government, with all these stakeholders and Canadians right across the country to ensure this doesn't happen. So rather than being cautiously optimistic, I'll say we're ready for the fight.
Okay, well, we are going to leave it there. Thank you very much for being here to react to this news just as it's breaking. Appreciate it, Catherine.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's Catherine Cobden, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. In moments of uncertainty, who can we turn to? Well, it's the power panel. Rob Brusso is the Canada correspondent for The Economist. Ginny Roth is a former Conservative campaign strategist. And here with me in studio, Vandana Katar is a former advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau. And Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. Hello, everybody. Rob, I want to start with you. So here we are once again sort of teetering on this moment. It was only a week ago that we got the reprieve from the tariffs, now across the board tariffs, and now we're sort of wobbling, wondering if we're about to fall into another tariff pit. How are you making sense of this moment?
By not trying to make sense. I actually think that silence in this instance by the government is wit. Silence is wisdom. What have we got? We've got a president who said he's going to bring in 25% tariffs. You wait to make sure that this is not part of the roller coaster whimsical ride that the president likes to take us on, gut churning as it might be. You pay no heed to what he says, but you do go over legal documents if there are documents that are accompanying this. And so far, there aren't. What do the documents say? What is the basis for any kind of tariffs? What part of U.S. law is he using in order to bring in these tariffs now? When do they take effect? None of these questions are answered now. We don't know that they're coming in. So what else do we do? Well, we count on the U.S. consumer. I think with the adventure that we had in the first weekend of February when he was talking about bringing in across-the-board tariffs on Canada, 25% and 10% for energy, the U.S. consumer came to our rescue in a way by calling on their members of Congress, senators and congressmen, and telling them, we don't want to pay more for gasoline. We don't want to pay more for other goods coming from Canada, for lumber and other things. Count on the U.S. consumer, get your ducks in a row, and remember to tell them that their cars, their airplanes, their missiles will cost more money. But for now, silence is wit and wisdom.
Vandana, we heard the argument earlier in the show from Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe talking about the fact that a response, counter tariffs hurt Canadians. So talk to me a little bit about the calculation around calibrating a response. To Rob's point, we don't know what's coming, but as we think of the bigger picture and how to respond, what comes to your mind?
We're going to navigate a few things. I think one, and something that Flavio Bopli said on social yesterday, is stop reacting to everything he says. That's what he wants. It's a way he tries to negotiate, try to get what he wants from this, and cause fear amongst Canadian concerns and force politicians their hand, right, or to show their hand. So I think that's one aspect of it. So keep calm, carry on, and be prepared. Be prepared that this is most likely going to happen, or it may not happen, or he'll turn to something else, or on Wednesday something else will happen.
Well, and on that note, as the executive orders come in, plastic straws are back. No word on tariffs yet, but something else has come in.
Well, there we go. I'm sure some people will be very happy with that. But, this is going to be the next 4 years. He's going to say one thing, say something else. He's going to change the goalposts over and over again. So that's one piece. I think for Scott Moe, and he didn't quite outright say it, I think for a lot of these economies, these tariffs will definitely hurt. I think of steel and aluminum in Quebec. Like there's oil, energy in like across the prairies. Like so they're going to protect their own economies too. But I respect that he also was trying to keep a national front, a national unity front. Like, I got to work with the federal government. I heard him say that to you. So I think that's good. I think that needs to continue. But just be mindful that some people might say, isn't it easier? And because they have to respond to their electorate too, like, how am I protecting you?
Ginny, I wonder about Pierre Poilievre in all of this when there isn't a lot of daylight between the federal leaders. Obviously, he's out there. He's today putting out a position in terms of what could be done in Canada's north to firm up Canada's position in the Arctic. But on the fundamental question of the day, which is about tariffs, if all the major party leaders seem to be more or less in agreement, where does that leave Pierre Poilievre in terms of the argument that he is trying to make to just get himself in the conversation?
Well, let me talk about a few big differences, maybe. One is, I think, especially on steel, Trump's issue is clearly with China. And frankly, Canada should be too. That is where we know the steel dumping is coming from. That's what's distorting markets. That's the market that no one can trade freely with because they're not fair. And so I think that's why you saw Poilievre come out with tariffs against China before our government did, because he was trying to show to the U.S. that he was serious about not being a backdoor to China.
I'm going to jump in here, Ginny, just because we have the news that we have been spending much of the day waiting for. The alerts coming out on the wires right now. Trump signs 2 proclamations that extend original 2018 Section 232 investigation. Says White House official, aluminum tariffs are being raised to 25% from 10%. White House official proclamations will reinstate 25% tariff on steel imports for all countries. And of course, that is the important part for Canada, not necessarily coming as an enormous surprise to anybody who's been paying attention to the news today. But given all the back and forth, important to know that it looks like the action we've been waiting to see is actually happening now. I apologize, Ginny. I did interrupt you. If you want to talk a little, if you want to weigh in a little bit more on Mr. Poilievre's next steps here, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, look, the tariffs are on all countries. But I think ultimately the end game here is to really ice out China. And Poilievre has shown that he's more serious about that, I would argue, than the current government. The second thing is how we treat steel production domestically. We currently have a huge carbon tax. And, the leading contender for the Liberal leadership, Mark Carney, has said he wants to have a carbon tax in the form of an industrial price. So
does that suggest Mr. Poilievre doesn't want industrial carbon pricing, Ginny?
Well, he doesn't want Carney's plan. Which
sure, but whether he wants industrial carbon pricing is, I think unto itself a very significant.
Poilievre has said is up to the provinces, and that he doesn't think there should be a carbon tax. So I take that to mean that he doesn't want to add costs, both in the form of carbon price and also in the form of insane regulation, right? Like ask steel producers in Canada about the extent to which they've been taxed and regulated by their own country. And so there are things we can do. Like these companies don't produce steel in a vacuum. You have to push back on tariffs, which, as you said, Poilievre, there's not a lot of daylight between the leaders on retaliation, and I think that's good. I think the U.S. needs to understand that we will retaliate, and that, to Rob's point, consumers in the U.S. will feel the impact of this because they buy so much of our steel today. But we also have to think about what we do for Canada and within Canada and the policies that have led us to this point where our steel producers are so much more vulnerable to these tariffs because of domestic policy to date.
Okay, so a couple of things to say here. Donald Trump making comments in the White House. Obviously, as soon as we have tape of these comments, we will put it to air. We're just waiting for that tape to be returned. Ginny raised the point of questions about steel dumping and the alerts coming over the wire suggesting that Peter Navarro is talking about how Trump's actions will end foreign dumping, boost domestic production, secure steel and aluminum industries as a backbone of U.S. security. Now, it is worth noting that Canada does have measures in place to counter the presence of Chinese steel in this country, measures that have come into place since the last time we had this particular discussion with the United States. And folks in industry have talked about the idea that Canada has shored up its efforts on that front, that ought to have perhaps protected us, Jordan, from the situation we now find ourselves in. Obviously, that wasn't the case. And I guess it brings us back to this fundamental question of when these are core values for Donald Trump and his administration, as Canadians potentially sit through counter tariffs and feel the squeeze and the pain of some of these things. How do politicians ask them to make sense of the fact that their lives are getting harder and we don't know if we're throwing spaghetti at the wall or not here?
Yeah, it's a really tough one because I think the operating mission of Trump as president is chaos, right? And it's the instability and his desire to keep those he views as his opponents, which includes, unfortunately, Canada as his closest ally, off balance. And so I think one of the things, and Rob talked about this as well, is that jumping at every word he says does feed into that cycle of chaos. So I think you did see a fairly restrained response kind of across the political spectrum in Canada today, not a whole lot of daylight between people on retaliation, because there is a sense that the only way to make a meaningful pushback to this type of action is with strength, with a show of force. Now, unfortunately, of course, that does mean that is going to put some burden on Canadian industry. And I think that's where some of the things that you saw Jagmeet Singh and the NDP talking about today are going to be really important. And the labor movement was out talking about this as well, the need for greater supports for workers to shore up things like our employment insurance system, which we know does have major gaps in it ahead of time, ahead of knowing that there's going to potentially be layoffs, not just in these two sectors, but perhaps more broadly as we see bigger tariffs coming in maybe later in the month. So there's things that can be done right now. There's things that can be done in the medium and the long term around diversifying our trade relationships. Arguably, this is a conversation that we had in the first Trump term that we did not maybe follow all the way through under the Liberal government. And so that's something that needs further attention for sure. And so those are steps that can be taken here in Canada. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face is that the sort of pain here at home for any counter tariffs that happen is not going to be felt equally across regions and industries. And so that's going to be really, I think, one of the biggest challenges for this federal government or any future federal government to manage is some of those regional inequities.
Rob, that raises such an interesting point. I will also just note we're getting these alerts coming out across the wires, primarily from our colleagues at Reuters, waiting still to get the tape in, which again, we will play the moment that we have it. Donald Trump saying no exceptions or exemptions. Certainly there were some in Canada that hoped that and still, I'm sure, hope that there is a path forward for Canada where Canada could secure an exception or exemption. Although, as we've been discussing all through the program, Canada is the biggest source of imports for both aluminum and steel. So exemptions on that front would be quite significant. Rob, I think what Jordan was talking about there is so interesting because, of course, we just heard David McNaughton talking a few minutes ago about this sense of feistiness, this sense of unity that we feel in the country right now and trying to put that to good purpose. And yet you can imagine that kind of smashing up against the sense of regional difference that Jordan is talking about that might sort of get pulled at as some folks feel the pressure of this tariff pain, I suppose. Talk to me a bit about what comes to your mind when you think about the path forward for Canada and all trying to stay on the same page and maximize our sense of unity and nationhood right now.
Sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of things we need to clarify first. I don't know if the alerts make this clear, but are the tariffs effective immediately, or is there an active date when they do come into effect? If there's an active date.
No data available to us yet. Yeah.
Okay. Because if there's a later date, that leaves time for the kind of horse trading that we saw that led to an extension for Canada. That's an important thing to do. Look, the reality is the United States does not have the capacity to supply its own steel, let alone its own aluminum. In aluminum alone, it would take the construction of 6 more Hoover dams for the United States to supply its own aluminum. That would take decades. Okay, it's not going to happen. So again, Canadian consumer comes to our American consumer comes to our aid. The other thing that we need to do is. The last set of tariffs was punitive against Canada and Mexico. They were aimed to be punitive. This is broad across the world. So we need to coordinate with our allies to make sure that we don't get into a dumping war with them. That would be important to make sure that a bad situation doesn't get worse. I think the next thing that Canada needs to do or is thinking about doing is start thinking about big infrastructure projects that need to be developed here in Canada and get them up on the board quickly in order to deal with what could be a surplus in steel and aluminum. The other thing that I think everybody is probably aware of is the Canadian government has in place, and they had in place ahead of the last tariff threat, a fairly robust package of supports for workers and businesses affected by this. Everything from supplying credit for businesses that might face a credit crunch if this happens, to waiving the waiting period for EI. If all of a sudden you're an aluminum worker in Arvida, Quebec, and you're thrown out of work, you won't have to wait the usual period. So there are things already that are sort of in the catapult waiting to be shot out that way. But there's going to be some quick thinking that needs to be done to prevent dumping and also to get infrastructure projects, to get that surplus used for worthy projects here in Canada.
That's interesting. BC has, in fact, identified projects to fast track, although to my mind, they were not specifically about steel and aluminum, but just this broader conversation about Canada standing on its own 2 feet. It feels almost cartoonish to keep reading these red alerts off the wires as we talk about remaining calm. But additional comments from Donald Trump that they're also looking at tariffs on cars, chips, and pharmaceuticals. Obviously, all of those things would be of concern to Canadians. And we heard Donald Trump talking about reciprocal tariffs last night. We're still trying to get a sense of the shape of that and what that would mean. He says those we will do reciprocal tariffs in the next 2 days. So obviously, what does do mean? We will try to figure that out.
Could I just jump in, Catherine,
please.
with one more figures, because I work for a magazine that fills my head with figures. And I think an important figure for Canadians to realize is $36 trillion in debt. That's what the United States has for debt. We have a debt to GDP ratio of around 42%. They have a debt to GDP ratio of 120%. If they want to cut taxes and do it in a way that doesn't have the IMF knocking on their door, they're going to have to raise money. So I think the world is going to have to realize that tariffs are going to be part of our future, and American consumers might have to realize that as well.
Well, and interestingly, perhaps in that vein, Trump asked what if other countries retaliate, says he does not mind, which is, I think, an interesting contrast to the situation we found ourselves in just recently with these across-the-board tariffs, when it was suggested that if Canada were to retaliate, that there would be further retaliation. Ginny, I want to go big picture with you for a sec, because as we talk about, remaining calm, not freaking out, understanding that Trump is perhaps trying to uses destabilizing people and this sort of scattershot chaos of information as a means of keeping the people he's dealing with destabilized. Do you think that means for Canadians on this question of our sovereignty that we are just going to have to eat these comments that we are, not a viable country, that the United States wants to absorb us in some function for the next 4 years? Should Canadians sort of wrap their brain around the fact that we just have to suck it up?
Well, I don't think we should dismiss it as a joke, as the government initially did. I think we should take it seriously, but I also don't think we should light our hair on fire. We have to be reasonable about what we can do. We have to push back on punitive tariffs, and we have to do things that, frankly, many of us thought we should have already been doing. Strengthening our border, strengthening our ports, strengthening defense spending, strengthening our presence in the Arctic, all the things that a serious country would and should do. I think we should do that anyway, regardless of what Trump thinks. Trump happens to have raised it recently. And so my hope is that it causes Canadians to take that a little more seriously and want that in a future government. And I think you're hearing a bit of that from Poilievre. And even, on this question of our GDP and the GDP hit we could sustain, it caused us to have a slightly more serious conversation about interprovincial trade. Suddenly you have cabinet ministers who were opposed to pipelines and transferring oil and gas across the province say maybe we do need an east-west pipeline. These are the kinds of things that a serious country would do and pursue, and maybe this is an opportunity to finally do that.
A question I really wonder about, though, Ginny, when we talk about being serious about the border, this $1.3 billion border plan, the things like the leasing the Black Hawk helicopters, where is the line between what's serious and what is a show for Donald Trump? I'm obviously not personally an expert in border security, and I don't deny that helicopters could serve a purpose, but I think I also have some question of where the line is between what's in Canadians' best interest and what is about making a point to the Americans.
I think that's a reasonable question. You have an incumbent government and a Liberal Party that does seem to be doing these things for show. I think because they're sort of like flailing from one end to the other, trying to respond to what Trump wants of people. When you had like immigration surge totally out of control to really, really high levels. You had Roxham Road as a problem for serious parts of the last 9 years. Liberals been in power, just like not taking the border seriously. And then you have Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives who have been talking for years about how we have to be more serious about cars, auto theft, and how cars get shipped out at our ports, immigration levels, and what's the right mix for what our economy needs and what we can absorb. Like, all those things are not responses to Trump. They're just serious policies about what we need to do to be a sovereign country and have secure borders when it comes to both the movement of people and goods, criminal behavior, all that kind of thing that a reasonable government would do. And then, frankly, the Stephen Harper government was quite serious about. And so I agree, we shouldn't be, the helicopters, like, I'm not an expert, I don't know the specific role that they're playing, but we shouldn't be aiming for the TV clips or like the Fox News hit. We should be doing what's right for the country.
Yeah, I mean, I know someone is going to point out that Stephen Harper did make some cuts to border security, but the broader point, the CBSA agent specifically, Vandana, though, Ginny has raised some questions about the seriousness with which Canada has dealt with a whole multitude of issues. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we have been dealing with those. The government has dealt with those issues. There has been money at the border before all this has happened.
And yet this significant increase seems to be necessary, right? So
sure.
there's a bit of a challenge there of saying, well, we were doing the thing, but also we're going to do $1.3 billion more of the thing.
Sure, we are doing the things, and then someone else comes and says, but I want more of the things. So you're going to add more to the things, right, in order to help save Canadians. Canadians are also, you're also able to lift and shift as the environment changes. So, Roxham Road, there was a renegotiation of the safe third-party agreement. Like, those things do get fixed. Do they get the airtime on the day-to-day basis the way they are now? Absolutely not, right? So unless you're tuned into those issues, may not have noticed them. But I will say on this point, yes, like, if Trump is saying there's a border issue, you're going to put more money into it. Even if you put money before it saying, oh, I did this already, isn't going to be enough for him. So you're going to showcase, okay, what else do you need? We're going to put more money into the border. We're going to help alleviate any concerns you have. But this is the border. There'll be something else tomorrow.
Okay. Jordan, what do you think about this question of how Canada, the positioning Canada now finds itself in as it tries to show both its sovereignty, its seriousness as a country, and just push back against Trump generally?
Well, I'm an old timer, so my mind reaches back to the Harper government. And, look, clearly we have problems with our military capacity. We have issues with our border security. But those issues also didn't arise yesterday. And I think, it's important to acknowledge that underfunding of the military is a problem that existed during the Harper government. In fact, the lowest spending in terms of GDP per capita was under the Harper government in modern history. So I don't think you can really tie that to one specific government in recent history. There's an ongoing problem there. Canada is going to need to look to its own security in a new way now. That much is clear. We have the capacity to make investments that benefit our communities as well as helping to meet that 2% target. Premier Canoe in Manitoba has been out talking a great deal about the way that some of those investments in Canadian defence can also shore up communities. And I think that there's a lot to be taken from that. But I did note with some interest today that Pierre Poilievre, as much as he was up in Nunavut making his announcement, appeared to do it without having had any conversation with the Premier of Iqaluit, who actually issued a letter saying, I'm sorry, but when you come to the north, you speak with Northerners. You don't tell us what to do with Southern priorities. So I think that there's certainly maybe something to be learned there for him and his team about how to approach some of these issues. It's not just symbolic. It is about working with the different regions of the country and bringing people together around some of these threats in a serious way.
Rob, I do think, there's this instinct to keep coming back to, we talked about it earlier, right? Canadians coming together and some of these solutions that get talked about as means of Canada muscling up for this moment, be it creating an east-west pipeline, diversifying trade with other countries, interprovincial trade. And I've said this on air a few times. Somebody's going to write me a letter at some point. But I have trouble even saying interprovincial trade barriers without rolling my eyes, because you, I'm sure, were the one who assigned me as soon as I got here to covering some of those issues, which was, cough, cough, a decade ago. How realistic are these solutions that we're talking about? Or these measures, I suppose. Solutions is perhaps not the right term. But these measures that we're talking about to try to sort of solidify Canada's footing right now.
Well, there are interim measures and there are longer-term measures. Interim measures, there's still some capacity in the TMX pipeline. Canada, I believe, is already making the case to the United States that if you don't want more of our energy, and that would be a way, for instance, to very quickly deal with what Mr. Trump calls the trade deficit. If we sent less energy to the United States, we have more capacity to send it to TMX and send it to Asia. That would deal with the trade deficit very, very quickly. It would also result in an increase in the cost of gasoline to Midwestern drivers. The longer term thing, I think it makes more sense to build pipelines from the oil fields to the West Coast. That's really where the growth in oil and energy is going to be. I heard Jordan speak about being an old timer. Then that's an opening for me to allow for our Grandpa Simpson moment, because whenever I hear talk of the border, I'm reminded of the thundering baritone of Derek Burney, who greeted me when I was not wet behind the ears, but soaking behind the ears as a reporter during the '88 Free Trade Agreement. And his thundering voice is yelling right now, what about our interests on the border? Who is asking for something on our side of the border? Because the truth is the United States is a net exporter of crime, of guns, of drugs to Canada. So what are we asking for them to do on their side of the border as well? Is anybody asking them for reciprocal hardening in terms of security of their side of the border? I don't hear a lot about that.
I was really hoping it was the, when I was your age, I used to wear an onion on my belt, Grandpa Simpson's quote. That was much more thoughtful, frankly, Rob Russo. Ginny, I'm curious. I was struck seeing Jagmeet Singh on CNN today making the case for Canada. We've seen a lot of Canadian cabinet ministers. We've seen premiers. Where are the federal Conservatives in terms of being out there making the case for Canada to Americans?
I mean, Pierre Poilievre was in the Arctic today making the case for Canada. And
But to Americans, I'm talking about. Yeah.
I mean, every time Pierre Poilievre opens his mouth, he says Canada first, and I think that's a message for Canadians. He's running to be Prime Minister of Canada. I think to Rob's point, the impact of tariffs on American consumers will make itself very, very clear very, very quickly. And I think, though, that impact will speak way louder than, frankly, a lot of, Johnny-come-lately, false, newfound patriotism on the part of a lot of left-of-center leaders, whether it's Liberal or NDP, who were recently calling Canada a genocidal state, post-national, the hotel of the world. All of a sudden now we're these grand patriots. And to go on CNN or whatever it is and spout off about how we have to fight back with no real substance behind it, all I think to kind of curry favor with, frankly, a left-wing audience in Canada back home, I just think is kind of grandstanding and doesn't really drive at serious solutions and a real plan. So I'm glad to see Poilievre speaking to Canadians and speaking about a specific plan about what he would do.
Vonda and I could see that you had some feelings about that. Would you like to respond?
I think two things can be true. I think Canada could have done genocidal cultural impacts on Indigenous communities and still be a place that you're proud of. My parents came to Canada in the 70s. They never taught me to be not proud of it, but like many countries, there's a history, and you can learn from that history, and there's beauty to the history, and there's bad things to the history. The point is, do you learn about it? I don't think that was the only thing we talked about in Canada. We've always said Canada is diversity is our strength. We've always talked about the people in Canada and how everyone, Canadians love us. People around the world love Canada. And I disagree with the fact that just because you can bring up wrongs that have happened doesn't mean you can't be proud of your country. In fact, it makes you more proud of your country because you can learn from that and do better. So I think that's short-sighted. I think the issue is that Mr. Poilievre, that is one thing to talk to Canadians, sure, but to actually get the job done and make the impact and make the conversation to Americans, to Rob's point, the American consumer can come to our rescue. Governors and other Congress people can come to our rescue and help make the case for why this is a bad idea. I think that is something he's falling short on.
Okay, I will just say for folks who are just tuning in, we are still waiting for tape from the White House. Donald Trump has indeed announced plans for tariffs. You signed the executive order going ahead with tariffs for steel and aluminum for countries across the world. But of course, Canada, being the biggest exporter of both steel and aluminum to the United States, is going to have a particular impact on this country. We are still waiting for that tape. We are going to bring it to you as soon as it is available. Right now, though, you get the best analysis and insight from your friends at the Power Panel. Jordan, I'm going to turn to you here. And maybe just reflect a bit on the path forward. You know, there's been so much like Canada kind of coming to the edge of the cliff, worrying about things, and we haven't actually felt the impact. Again, I don't have the piece of paper to put in front of you, but it seems that as if Donald Trump has gone ahead with this. So talk to me a bit about what you see as the path forward for Canada now.
Well, I mean, I think, of course, the most immediate thing is support for the affected industries, for the workers who may be impacted by layoffs very shortly. That's going to be the very first thing that I'm sure is on the minds of not just the federal government, but particularly the governments of Ontario and Quebec. I mean, the timing is also interesting because, of course, we're in the midst of an Ontario election. Steel tariffs have the biggest impact in Ontario, and Doug Ford is headed down as premier, but also simultaneously as candidate to Washington tomorrow to have some of these discussions. So it'll be interesting to see what impact there is. I'm sure he's actually in some way probably not unhappy to have something fresh to kind of talk about there to underline the urgency of that trip in the middle of a campaign. But I think more broadly, there needs to be ongoing work on the part of the federal government to bring the premiers together to continue those discussions. The risk of that regional fragmentation is going to increase as the pressure increases and as time goes on. Holding provinces like Alberta, like Saskatchewan, like Quebec on side is going to be a continuous, I think, challenge, and there's going to need to be those discussions. It has been interesting to see, for example, some new openness on the part of folks in Quebec to the idea of an east-west pipeline, something that would have been a complete political non-starter just a few years ago. And, and I think to Ginny's point, that was a challenge that even the Harper government had, even in arguably more favorable regulatory circumstances for the industry. They were still not able to get through those major projects. So things are changing on the ground very quickly, but what's going to be hard is to sustain that over the long term. And if we accept that tariffs are a part of the economic reality in our trade relationship with the United States, not just for the short term, but maybe more for the medium term, because they need it as a revenue generator, the challenge will be to hold people together across the country over that longer time period as things get a little bit harder and more expensive here at home too.
And Rob, one of the things that makes what is happening right now interesting is the fact that it does not just affect Canada or Canada and Mexico, although, again, as I keep saying, Canada is particularly hard hit. Can you reflect a little bit on the willingness of the world to sort of come together and push back against some of the things that Donald Trump is doing right now, be they just about sort of the economic might as he perceives it of the American nation, or his expansionist attitudes towards Greenland, the Panama Canal, and perhaps Canada too?
Well, we'll see. We didn't get a lot of very stout support anywhere when we were threatened with tariffs in the last round. It'll be interesting to see if there is some sort of coordination. There are other markets for our steel and our aluminum. We will be able to displace Chinese and Russian steel and aluminum if we do get some sort of coordination with our allies. But look, the reality is, even with reduction of internal trade barriers, even with greater trade agreements with our allies, there is a sort of magnetic pull to the south. It's because of geography, and it's also because with Mexico, there is a market of 500 million people over land without the need to ship, without the need to fly. That magnetic pull is irrevocable. So I think while we continue to work on other options and build up our own infrastructure and build up our own internal market, not a bad thing, right? That market to the south of us is worth billions and billions of dollars. Right now, it's just to the U.S. alone, it's $1.3 billion a day. Okay, so we're not going to be able to replace that by going overseas. I think the strategic objective of Canada remains to try and maintain low-cost access to the most lucrative market in the world, and that's south of our border. While we do those other things, yes, go ahead and do it, but we cannot negate the reality of that magnetic pull.
Okay. My thanks very much to the Power Panel for this conversation today as we get the breaking news that Donald Trump is indeed going ahead with these tariffs, 25% on steel and aluminum. He has signed the executive orders. There will be no exemptions that will include Canadian products as well. Thank you to the Power Panel, Rob Russo, Ginny Roth, Bandana Qatar, and Jordan Leibniz.